Let's start with something dark. Something that most men sense but few dare to put into words. Something Freud saw clearly over a century ago. The sweet melodies of romantic ideals don't govern a woman's loyalty. It's not grounded in values or even emotions. Her unconscious loyalty is to power. And it's been that way since the beginning of human history. If you study ancient civilizations, not through fantasy but through biological reality, you'll see the same pattern repeated. When a tribe was conquered, when a city fell, when war reduced everything to rubble, the women didn't resist. They didn't mourn their defeated men forever. They adapted. They realigned. They gravitated toward the victors, not out of affection, but out of an instinct for survival that was as ancient as it was enduring. They bore the children of the enemy. They raised families with the conqueror's blood, not because they forgot the past, but because evolution doesn't honor memory. It honors adaptation. That cold, primal intelligence still lives in the modern feminine psyche. It's not about betrayal. It's about survival. It's not about what she consciously wants. It's about what her nervous system is wired to seek. And Freud knew this. He wasn't trying to insult women. He was trying to expose the machinery underneath their behavior. Behavior that often makes no logical sense to the men who watch it unfold. He looked past words, past appearances, and into the deep unconscious motivations that steer the ship of feminine desire. What did he find? He found a structure, not a mess, not chaos, but a dynamic system of competing instincts that live below awareness. At the heart of this system, he identified three core forces: the id, the superego, and the ego. Let's break those down in a way that makes sense to men who have experienced that moment of confusion. The moment when a woman switches, when she pulls back without reason, when she tells you you're everything she's ever wanted, only to disappear the next week. The id is her most primal self. It is chaotic, impulsive, irrational, and brutally honest. The id doesn't care about your manners. It doesn't care if you open the car door. It doesn't care if you send flowers or write poems. The id is looking for one thing. Can he dominate my chaos without becoming it? It is drawn to power, to presence, to danger even. Not because she wants danger, but because her unconscious seeks strength. It seeks stability, but not the kind you talk about in therapy. It wants the strength that doesn't flinch in the face of her storms. Now the superego is her inner critic, the voice she inherited from her parents, from society, from school, from religion, from the culture that told her how a good girl should behave. The superego is all about rules, image, and self-restraint. It whispers, "Don't go there. Don't trust that. Be careful. Be pure. Be safe." So here's the conflict. The id wants surrender. The superego wants protection. And in the middle of these two ancient voices stands the ego, desperately trying to keep the system intact. What does that look like in real life? It looks like a woman who is turned on by strength, but shames herself for desiring it. It looks like a woman who flirts and smiles at you, but then goes cold. She opens herself up one moment and shuts down the next. You think she's unstable, but she's not. She's split. She's navigating an invisible war between what her body wants and what her mind was trained to fear. And this is where most men get lost. They take the hot and cold behavior personally. They think they said something wrong, that maybe she's just playing games. But Freud would say this isn't about you. It's about her unconscious fighting itself. What you're experiencing is repression, in motion. Her id wants to be taken. Her superego wants to run. Her ego? It just wants to survive without collapsing. So what does she do? She sends mixed signals. She keeps one foot in and one foot out. She watches your stories but doesn't reply to your messages. She kisses you like she's starving and disappears for 3 days. She's not trying to hurt you. She's trying to protect the fragile architecture of her identity, the one that can't reconcile desire and safety in the same space. And this is where your strength as a man is tested. Not by how hard you chase her, but by whether you understand what's happening. She's not rejecting you. She's rejecting the risk of being seen. And if you respond to her retreat by chasing harder, you become exactly what her unconscious feared. Predictable, controllable, and safe in a way that feels wrong. Because the truth is, many women aren't used to peace. They're addicted to tension, not by choice, but by training. Think back to her childhood. because that's where Freud always started. Maybe she grew up reaching for a father who was emotionally distant. Maybe she experienced love as something inconsistent, there one moment, gone the next. Maybe the first man she ever trusted made her feel invisible, or worse, made her feel like love had to be earned. That pain doesn't vanish, it goes underground. And when you, the modern man, show up in her life with emotional presence, honesty, and warmth, you don't feel familiar. You feel foreign. Her nervous system, trained by absence, starts to sound the alarm. He's too close. This is unsafe. And so she withdraws. Not because you did something wrong, but because your presence awakened a part of her she wasn't ready to face. This is repression. This is the unconscious defense Freud spent his life studying. It's the part of the mind that buries truths that feel too dangerous to accept. She doesn't ghost you because she stopped liking you. She disappears because being seen in your presence feels overwhelming, and it threatens the control she spent her whole life building. You're not dealing with a woman in the present. You're dealing with her psychological history, her internal script, her unresolved wounds. And here's the kicker. The more stable and grounded you are, the more threatening you feel, not because you're unsafe, but because you don't match the pattern. You're not the emotional roller coaster. You're not the familiar drama. You're peace. But peace feels alien to someone raised on chaos. So what do? You stop trying to fix it. You stop internalizing her confusion. You stop chasing answers to questions that were never yours to solve. Instead, you recognize the pattern. You watch without reacting. You see her push and pull for what it is, not a test of your worth, but a reflection of her inner war. Freud believed that the unconscious would rather protect the lie than risk exposure to the truth. And when you see her behavior through this lens, it stops being mysterious. It becomes predictable, not because she's manipulative, but because the mind will always move in the direction of its deepest training. You thought her silence meant disinterest, but what it means is that your presence got too close to the part of her that she hasn't healed. And if you mistake that for rejection, you'll do what every other man does. You'll chase, you'll explain, you'll try to rescue her from the very thing she believes protects her. And in doing so, you'll lose the one thing she truly responds to, your emotional sovereignty. There's a moment every man faces, the moment when everything seems perfect. Her eyes linger on you. Her smile reaches deeper than before. Her tone softens. And just when you begin to lean in, to let your guard down, to believe that this could be real, she pulls back. She retreats, disappears, or worse, acts like none of it ever mattered. You're left staring at the same texts, the same memories, wondering, what just happened? Freud would have had a name for this, a system for it. He didn't see it as confusion or immaturity or random emotional shifts. He saw it as a precise psychological mechanism, reaction formation, a defense strategy where the unconscious mind expresses the exact opposite of what it truly feels, because the truth is too dangerous to face. So when she acts indifferent just after showing desire, when she talks about needing space right after sharing her dreams, that's not her trying to play a game. That's her unconscious trying to protect her identity from exposure. Her id wants intimacy, wants surrender. But her superego, the voice of judgment, shame, and childhood programming, won't allow it. And so her ego builds the mask. Distance, sarcasm, silence. This is where many men fall into a dangerous pattern. You try to decode her behavior logically. You think, maybe I was too vulnerable. Maybe I should pull back to get her attention. Maybe if I show her how much I care, she'll come back around. But Freud would warn you, don't confuse her retreat with a request to chase. That's not what her psyche needs. What it needs is containment. It needs to feel the presence of a man who will not collapse into her storm, but hold his ground while the storm rages. Because here's the truth. Her unconscious doesn't trust love. Not yet. Not fully. Not in a way that lets her relax into it. Why? Because somewhere in her past, love was fused with pain, with abandonment, with inconsistency, with powerlessness. Maybe her first experiences of love were conditional. Maybe the affection she received came with strings attached. Be good, be pretty, be quiet. Maybe she learned to be desirable as a survival tactic. Attention became currency. And if you've ever wondered why some women seem to flirt without intention, seduce without surrender, or push desire into the air without ever grounding it, it's because their earliest lesson was this: if I can make him want me, I can control what hurts me. So now, as an adult, she performs. She projects sexual energy. The slow blink, the delicate touch, the curve of the hip. It activates your masculine drive. But just as you respond, she retreats. Not because she didn't mean it, but because she did. And that truth is too intimate for her to hold. This is the emotional tug-of-war. Not between you and her, but within her. Her id says, let him take you. Her superego says, he'll break you. Her ego says, stay in control. So what does she do? She flirts and withdraws. She sends signals and then erases them. She mirrors your attention but refuses your presence. And you feel caught, confused, disoriented, even doubting your intuition. But you must understand this. What you're experiencing isn't a test. It's a script. A pattern buried so deep in her psychology that even she doesn't know she's following it. She doesn't want to manipulate you. She's trying to preserve herself. You might think, well, if she's so scared, why does she initiate closeness at all? Why start something she doesn't want to finish? Because the hunger is real. The feminine unconscious is a vessel aching to be filled, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. But when the craving for connection rises, the fear of annihilation rises too. Not literal death, but ego death. Identity collapse. Vulnerability. You don't just represent a man, you represent a mirror. A mirror that reflects everything she's suppressed, her need, her softness, her longing to be claimed without shame. And for a woman who's spent her life armoring herself with independence, that reflection is terrifying. That's why she doesn't want to feel safe. She wants to feel contained, not babied, not praised. Contained. She wants to know that when her chaos erupts, when her emotions surge, when her voice rises, when her defenses crack, you won't react, won't flee, won't beg. You'll hold. Stillness, not softness, is what steadies her. But here's the trap. When she pulls back, most men panic. They chase. They try to fix. They ask, what's wrong? What did I do? And in that moment, they prove her unconscious fears right. That no man can handle her full intensity. That once she reveals her chaos, she'll be abandoned. So, how do you break this cycle? Not by matching her inconsistency with your own. Not by playing the same game in reverse. But by stepping outside the game altogether. You recognize the pattern. You see that her silence is not rejection, it's rehearsal. Rehearsal for the abandonment she assumes is inevitable. She's playing out the same fear over and over, trying to gain control over it by being the one who disappears first. Freud believed that repetition was the unconscious mind's attempt to master trauma, not by avoiding it, but by recreating it until it feels safe. And so she draws you in and pulls away. She tests your presence and then hides from it, because some part of her believes that if she can control the loss, it won't hurt as much. But here's the dangerous irony. The more you chase, the more she'll run. The more you try to soothe her fear with words, the more her unconscious interprets you as weak, available in a way that doesn't feel earned. Because this is the deeper layer Freud uncovered. The feminine psyche doesn't trust love that costs nothing. It distrusts approval that is given too freely. Why? Because in her world, affection was never unconditional. It was earned. It was scarce. It was wrapped in complexity. And now, in adulthood, she projects that same expectation onto men. That's why she's attracted to emotional distance. That's why she responds to men who don't react. That's why your kindness alone isn't enough. She doesn't need you to give more. She needs you to stand firm. And if you can do that, not by manipulating, but by seeing, you step into a position no other man has held in her life. You become the one thing she can't control, a man who will not betray himself to win her. And that, more than charm, more than looks, more than money, is what cracks the code. Because a woman can push away the man who wants her, but she cannot control the man who knows who he is. You've probably lived this moment before. She looks into your eyes and says, "You're the one." She talks about babies, about building a life, about wanting forever. And something in you, something deep, starts to believe this time it's real. But just as the fantasy begins to feel solid, something shifts. She pulls away, changed her mind, accuses you of things you never did, and suddenly, you're standing in the ruins of a dream that only yesterday felt like home. You start questioning everything. Was I too much? Not enough? Did I say the wrong thing? Was I ever even what she wanted? Freud would say, stop, because what just happened wasn't about logic. It wasn't about your behavior. It was a projection, a psychological defense that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with the war inside her. Projection happens when the mind cannot handle its conflict, so it offloads the tension onto someone else. The unconscious essentially says, I can't face this part of me, so I'll see it in you. So in her case, she wasn't lying when she said she wanted you. She believed it. But what she was falling in love with was the idea of you, the illusion that you could be her safe place, her rescue, her escape. But as soon as that fantasy started inching toward reality, her unconscious kicked in. The superego, the internalized voices of fear, trauma, and cultural shame began whispering, you're not ready. He'll leave. This will end badly. Trust equals pain. So instead of confronting that fear internally, her psyche looked outward and made you the problem. Now you're the emotionally unstable one. Now you're the reason she can't open up. Now you're the excuse her mind needs to self-destruct the very dream she built with you. And this is where men collapse. They try to fix the image she projected onto them. They take the blame. They apologize, explain, and overcompensate. They don't realize they've stepped into someone else's psychological theater and been cast as the villain in a story they didn't write. But no matter how hard you try to be the hero, you can't rewrite a script that was never yours. You can't save someone from the ghosts they're still dancing with. And that's what Freud warned us about. Because when a woman hasn't resolved her trauma, she doesn't relate to you directly. She relates to you through her past. And that's when you become a placeholder, a mirror, a stage. Here's the twist, though. The trap isn't just hers, it's yours too. Because something inside you, some unhealed part, chose her. Not because she was healthy, not because she was good for you, but because her emotional inconsistency felt familiar. And here's the brutal truth. Familiarity feels like love to the wounded. So when she pulls away, your inner child wakes up. The boy who once felt unseen, unloved, invisible. That boy starts to believe, if I can make her love me, I'll finally be enough. But that was never her responsibility. It was never her job to heal your wound. And yet, every time she becomes distant, every time she gives you just enough to keep you chasing, you feel more addicted. Not because she's rare, but because scarcity is your native language. That's what Freud called displacement. When the emotions we can't resolve in their source get redirected somewhere else. You're not chasing her. You're chasing your unmet needs. You're trying to fix your mother's absence, or your father's coldness, or the emotional neglect that taught you love is something to earn, not receive. She's just the mirror, and the more she withdraws, the more valuable she seems. Not because she is valuable, but because your nervous system is wired to confuse pain with purpose. So, how do you break the spell? You wake up to the game, and you leave the stage. Not angrily, not dramatically, but silently, with clarity. Because once you see the pattern, your only job is to stop repeating it. You don't need closure. You don't need her to understand. You don't need a final conversation, a long text, or one last cry. You need to walk. Because no woman, no matter how beautiful, no matter how spiritual, no matter how magnetic, should have the power to destabilize your masculinity. The moment your emotional center is outsourced to her attention, you've lost the game. And Freud would say, that's the moment to begin your real work. Because power doesn't come from control, it comes from sublimation. Sublimation is the redirection of raw emotional energy into something higher, for the purpose, into strength, into building a life so meaningful that no woman becomes your reason for existing. So when she posts a story to provoke you, you train. When she withdraws, you create. When she confuses you with silence, you stay grounded. Your presence becomes a sanctuary for your soul, not a reaction to hers. Because the woman who manipulates can only do so to a man who needs something from her. But the man who stands complete, who doesn't seek mothering, rescuing, or validation, becomes untouchable. That's when her power ends, and yours begins. Because you're no longer negotiating with her ego, or her wounds, or her confusion. You're standing in your frame. You're listening not with desperation, but with discernment. And if she tests you, you don't flinch. Because you've remembered who you are. Not the boy seeking approval, but the man who carries his warmth. The man who doesn't fold under pressure, or bend to emotional chaos, or compromise his mission for temporary closeness. That man doesn't chase. He leads. And the feminine doesn't truly open to the man she can control. She opens to the one who stays still when everything else trembles. So what happens when you stop reacting? Her mask cracks. Because the part of her that longs to be seen, really seen, feels your presence. And the part of her that's terrified of it begins to dissolve. And maybe she'll run. Maybe she won't. That's not your concern anymore. Because you're no longer playing the game. You're not there to be chosen. You've already chosen yourself. And that's the final truth Freud pointed toward. The unconscious repeats what it hasn't resolved. But the conscious man, the awake man, he transforms it. Not by fighting, not by fixing, but by standing so rooted in his reality that the ghosts of his past can no longer possess him. She was never your destiny. She was your mirror. And now, you no longer bleed for reflections.